At exactly 6 o'clock on Christmas Day, my phone received 23 calls in less than 10 minutes. I know that because I counted them later. At the time, I was sitting by a window, holding a hot cup of coffee and watching fresh snow drift across a quiet Vermont hillside. The only sounds in the cabin were the crackling fireplace and my dog snoring beside me. Then my phone lit up. One call, then another, then three more. A stream of texts followed so quickly that the screen barely stopped vibrating. My ex-husband, my daughter, my son, all trying to reach me at once. The strange part wasn't that they were calling. The strange part was that I knew exactly when those calls would start. Have you ever been blamed for everything, even when you're the one paying for it? Have you ever spent years trying to keep people happy, only to become the person they complain about the most? For 15 straight Christmases, I paid for every holiday gathering my family demanded. The cabins, the food, the gifts, the extras nobody remembers until the bill arrives. Yet somehow, I was always the problem. This Christmas, I decided to change one thing. Actually, I decided to stop doing one thing. And at 6 o'clock that evening, the consequences finally arrived. Before I tell you why my phone nearly exploded that night, tell me where you're watching from today. I love seeing how far this community reaches. And let me ask you this. Have you ever had family treat your generosity like an obligation? Let us know in the comments, because what happened at 6 o'clock started months earlier, and nobody saw it coming. My ex-husband Martin and I divorced nearly 16 years ago. The marriage ended, but one tradition refused to die: Christmas. When Alexis and Tyler were younger, I understood why keeping that tradition alive mattered. I didn't want them bouncing between households or feeling forced to choose sides during the holidays. So when Martin suggested renting a cabin in Aspen for Christmas, I agreed. The first year was actually nice. We spent time together, the kids laughed. There were no arguments about schedules or custody arrangements. For a few days, everyone acted like a family again. At least that's how it started. Over time, the Christmas trips became less about being together and more about meeting expectations. And those expectations kept growing. What began as a simple holiday getaway slowly turned into a luxury production. The cabins got bigger, the catering got fancier, the gift lists got longer. One year, Alexis wanted a designer handbag. The next year, she wanted jewelry, then clothes from brands I could barely spell. Tyler wasn't much different. Every Christmas seemed to come with a new collection of expensive requests, special items, special experiences, special upgrades. Even Martin had opinions about everything. The cabin needed a better view. The menu needed more options. The decorations needed to look upscale. Every year there was another expense waiting around the corner, and every year I paid it. Not because anyone thanked me, because I thought keeping the peace was worth it. The strange thing wasn't how much money I spent. It was how little appreciation came with it. If the weather was too cold, I heard about it. If traffic delayed someone's arrival, I heard about it. If a restaurant reservation wasn't perfect, somehow that became my fault too. I could spend thousands creating the holiday they demanded, and within hours, someone would find a reason to complain. At first, I told myself families argue. Then I told myself the kids would mature. Then I told myself next year would be different. But next year never looked different. The criticism stayed. The complaints stayed. The blame stayed. Eventually, I noticed something that was hard to ignore. Nobody ever asked how I was doing. Nobody asked whether I wanted these trips. Nobody asked whether I could afford another increasingly expensive Christmas. They only wanted to know one thing. Was everything paid for? That realization hit harder than any argument ever could. Little by little, I began to understand a painful truth. They weren't excited to see me. They were excited to see what I was paying for. And that truth set the stage for the Christmas that changed everything. Last Christmas should have been the year everything finally went right. At least that's what I told myself while approving one payment after another. The cabin alone cost more than some people spend on an entire vacation. Then came the catering, then the gifts, then all the extra expenses nobody thinks about until the bill arrives. By the time Christmas Day rolled around, I had spent a little over $8,000. And honestly, I wasn't even upset about the money. What mattered to me was seeing my family enjoy themselves. For a few hours, it looked like that might actually happen. The cabin was beautiful. The dining table was covered with food, the fireplace glowed in the background. Wrapped gifts sat beneath the tree. Everyone seemed happy. For once, I thought maybe we'd make it through the holiday without a complaint. I was wrong. After dinner, Alexis opened her gift. I had spent weeks searching for a designer watch she had specifically requested. The moment she saw the brand name, she smiled for about 5 minutes. Then she started pressing the buttons, turning the dial, checking the display. Her expression changed immediately. "Mum, what's wrong with this thing?" I looked over. "What do you mean?" "It stopped working." I figured it was a simple setting issue. Maybe the battery needed charging. Maybe something had been activated accidentally. Normal things, minor things. But Alexis reacted as if the watch had exploded. "You spent all this money and couldn't make sure it worked?" The room went quiet. I tried to explain that we could contact the retailer after the holiday. That only made her angrier. Before I could say another word, Martin jumped into the conversation. "Honestly, Dana, this is exactly the kind of thing you do." I stared at him. "What does that even mean?" He shook his head. "You always cut corners somewhere." "Cut corners? After spending thousands of dollars on a trip I wasn't even asking for?" Before I could respond, Tyler added his own opinion. "It's like you always find a way to mess something up." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were new, because they were familiar. I had heard versions of them for years. The difference was that this time something inside me finally stopped making excuses for them. While they continued talking, I looked around the room at the plates, the glasses, the catered food, the decorations, the gifts under the tree. Every single thing in that room had been paid for by me. Yet somehow, I was sitting there feeling like an unwanted guest. Not a mother, not a family member, just a woman expected to cover the bill. The conversation moved on. The complaints faded. People started laughing again. Wine was poured. Music played. The evening continued, but I couldn't shake what I had just realized. For years, I thought I was buying family memories. What I was really buying was access, and even that came with criticism. Later that night, everyone gathered upstairs. The laughter carried through the cabin. Glasses clinked. Conversations filled the air. I sat alone downstairs. For the first time in years, I stopped asking myself how to make next Christmas better. Instead, I asked a different question. What would happen if I stopped paying for it? The answer came to me almost immediately. Next year, they would get exactly what they paid for. Before we continue, I want your opinion. After everything that happened at that dinner, would you have kept paying? Comment "keep paying" or "walk away" below. Because once I made that decision, there was no going back. By the time October arrived, I had almost forgotten about the promise I made to myself that Christmas night. Almost. Then the family group chat came back to life. Every year it started the same way. A few messages about holiday plans, a discussion about dates, a couple of suggestions, and before long, everyone was planning a Christmas trip they had no intention of paying for. The first message came from Martin. He dropped a link to a luxury cabin in Aspen. A few minutes later, he followed up with another message. "Looks perfect for this year." Not, "What do you think?" Not, "Can we afford this?" Not even, "Are you interested?" Just an assumption that the tradition would continue exactly as it always had. A few days later, Alexis started sending links. Designer clothes, electronics, accessories. Every message felt less like a suggestion and more like an order form. Tyler joined in shortly after. He wasn't focused on gifts. He wanted details about the catering. Could we get the same company as last year? Could they add more dessert options? Could they upgrade the holiday menu? The conversation rolled forward without a single person discussing who would actually be paying for any of it. Because in their minds, that question had already been answered. Me, as always. The old version of me would have pushed back. I would have argued. I would have complained about the cost. I would have explained how unreasonable everything had become. This time, I did none of that. I didn't object. I didn't agree. I didn't negotiate. I simply stayed quiet. Days passed, then weeks. Messages continued appearing in the group chat. Nobody noticed my silence, or if they did, they interpreted it the same way they always had. They assumed I was handling everything. The strange part was that nobody actually asked. Not once. Nobody sent a message saying, "Dana, are you okay with this?" Nobody asked whether I had made the reservations. Nobody checked whether the deposits had been paid. They didn't ask because they didn't think they needed to. For 15 years, I had trained them to expect it. Now I was watching that expectation operate all by itself. As November turned into December, reminder emails started arriving. The rental company wanted payment. The catering company wanted confirmation. Final balances were due. I read every email, then closed it. No responses, no payments, no explanations. Meanwhile, while everyone else was busy planning the Christmas they expected me to fund, I was quietly making plans of my own. And unlike the Aspen trip, this reservation would actually be paid for. A week before Christmas, I packed my car, loaded my dog Birdie into the passenger seat, and headed north. Not to Aspen, not to a luxury mountain resort, not to a giant cabin filled with complaints disguised as family traditions. I drove to a small town in Vermont. The cabin I rented wasn't impressive by anyone else's standards. It had one bedroom, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a view of snow-covered hills stretching into the distance. That was enough for me. Actually, it was more than enough. For the first time in years, I booked a Christmas trip based on what I wanted, not what everyone else expected. The first day felt strange. I kept waiting for something, a complaint, a demand, a last-minute problem that somehow became my responsibility. Instead, there was only silence. Good silence. The kind that lets you hear the wind outside. The kind that lets you finish a cup of coffee before it gets cold. The kind that reminds you how exhausting constant criticism can be. Birdie spent most of her time sleeping near the fireplace. I spent mine reading, walking through the snow, and enjoying the fact that nobody was asking me to solve their problems. No expensive requests. No arguments about accommodations. No debates over dinner menus. No pressure. Just peace. After a while, I realized something surprising. I wasn't missing the Aspen trips at all. I was only missing the idea of what I wished those trips had been. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow and clear skies. I made breakfast, took Birdie for a walk, watched families in town carrying gifts through the streets. It was easily the most relaxed Christmas I'd had in over a decade. But throughout the day, I kept glancing at my phone. Not because I was worried, because I knew something everyone else didn't. Certain bills had never been paid, certain reservations had never been confirmed, and sooner or later, someone was going to discover that. So while the day moved quietly around me, I found myself checking one thing over and over: the time. Because I knew exactly when reality was scheduled to arrive. Christmas afternoon couldn't have been more peaceful. Birdie was stretched out in front of the fireplace. A fresh layer of snow covered the hills outside. I had nowhere to be, nothing to organise, nobody demanding updates. For the first time in years, I wasn't managing a holiday. I was actually enjoying one. Meanwhile, several states away, my family was making their annual trip to Aspen. I knew the schedule by heart. They always arrived in the late afternoon. They always checked into the cabin around 6 o'clock. Dinner was usually served shortly afterward. For 15 years, everything had followed the same pattern. This year was going to be different. The only question was how long it would take them to realize it. At exactly 6 o'clock, my phone lit up. The first call came from Martin. I watched it ring, then stop. 5 seconds later, he called again. Before that call ended, Alexis's name appeared, then Tyler's, then Martin again. Within minutes, my screen looked like a flashing emergency alert. Call after call, message after message, voicemail after voicemail. I set my coffee down and looked at the growing list of notifications. Right on schedule. The first text from Martin read, "Call me now." The second wasn't any friendlier. "Where are you?" A few moments later, Alexis sent a message filled with capital letters and frustration. Tyler's texts were different. He sounded confused, then worried, then outright panicked. I finally opened one of the voicemails. The situation became clear immediately. The cabin management company had refused entry. The final balance had never been paid. Without payment, there was no active reservation, no keys, no access, no luxury Christmas cabin. At nearly the same time, they learned the catering company had cancelled the holiday dinner. Their deposit deadline had passed weeks earlier. No payment, no catering, no Christmas feast waiting inside, no carefully prepared holiday experience. Nothing. Just a parking lot, several suitcases, and a reality nobody expected. The messages became more desperate with each passing minute. Martin wanted answers. Alexis wanted someone to blame. Tyler wanted a solution. What struck me most wasn't that they were upset. It was that every message assumed the same thing, that I would fix it. Even now, even after months of silence, even after not confirming a single reservation, their first instinct wasn't to solve the problem themselves. Their first instinct was to call me. For years, I had rescued every holiday crisis before it could become visible. This time, there was nothing to rescue, only consequences. I could have answered immediately. I could have explained everything. I could have stepped in and found another cabin, another dinner, another last-minute solution. That was exactly what the old version of me would have done. Instead, I stood up and walked into the kitchen. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. Then I returned to the window. Outside, snow drifted quietly across the hillside. Inside, my phone continued vibrating across the table. Call, text, voicemail. Call, text, voicemail. For once, I didn't rush to make everything better. I simply sat there and listened to the silence between notifications. Because sometimes, the most powerful answer is no answer at all. And that Christmas, 6 o'clock said everything I needed it to say. If you've ever learned the hard way that gratitude matters, subscribe before the next story finds you. And tell me this in the comments. What would you have done in my place? Would you have answered immediately, or let them figure it out themselves? After nearly an hour of non-stop calls and messages, I decided to answer. The moment I picked up, Martin started talking. Actually, talking isn't the right word. He was demanding answers. "Dana, where are you? What is going on? Why aren't we in the cabin?" Before I could respond, Alexis jumped in from somewhere nearby. "This is ridiculous. Everyone's standing outside. The rental company says there's no active reservation." Tyler sounded exhausted. "Mom, can you please tell us what's happening?" For a moment, I just listened, not because I was confused, because it was the first time all day they had sounded genuinely interested in hearing from me. When the noise finally settled down, I asked a simple question. "Did any of you pay for the cabin?" The line went quiet. Nobody answered. So I asked another. "Did any of you pay the catering company?" More silence. Then Martin spoke. "That's not the point." I almost laughed, because that was exactly the point. I took a sip of coffee and delivered the only response I felt they deserved. "I thought whoever booked it paid for it." Silence. Complete silence. For the first time in years, nobody had a comeback. Nobody had a criticism ready. Nobody had an excuse. Because we all knew the truth. Not one of them had expected to pay. They expected me to. I finally said what I should have said years earlier. I was never ruining Christmas. Nobody interrupted. I was financing it. The words hung there for a moment. 15 years of frustration packed into a single sentence. I explained how every holiday had become less about family and more about expectations. How every year came with larger bills and smaller amounts of appreciation. How I had grown tired of being treated like a problem while paying for everyone else's perfect holiday. The conversation ended exactly the way you'd expect. Nobody apologized. Nobody admitted they were wrong. A few harsh words were exchanged, and eventually the call disconnected. But even though the conversation ended badly, something important had finally changed. For the first time in 15 years, the responsibility wasn't sitting on my shoulders anymore. The days after Christmas were quiet. At first, the messages I received weren't much different from the phone calls. There was anger, frustration, a few attempts to make me feel guilty. According to Alexis, I had embarrassed the family. According to Martin, I had created unnecessary drama. Tyler stayed mostly out of the arguments, though he occasionally checked in to see how I was doing. That alone felt different. For the first time in a long while, someone was asking about me instead of asking me to pay for something. As the weeks passed, the emotions started cooling down. The shock wore off, and reality finally had room to settle in. The Aspen trip hadn't fallen apart because I ruined it. It fell apart because nobody took responsibility for it. That distinction mattered, whether they wanted to admit it or not. The following year brought a noticeable change. Nobody sent links to luxury cabins. Nobody forwarded expensive catering menus. Nobody assumed I was covering every cost. The expectation had finally been broken. Some relationships became more distant. I won't pretend otherwise. A few conversations grew shorter. A few traditions quietly disappeared. But something unexpected happened too. The interactions that remained started feeling more genuine. When my children called, they weren't calling because they needed something. They were calling because they wanted to talk. Those conversations weren't frequent, but they were real. And honestly, I'd take one sincere phone call over 100 entitled requests. Looking back, the best Christmas of my life wasn't the one with the biggest cabin. It wasn't the one with the most expensive gifts. It wasn't the one with the gourmet dinners or luxury views. It was the quiet Christmas in Vermont. The one spent with a sleeping dog, a fireplace, and complete peace of mind. The one where I didn't spend the day trying to earn approval. The one where nobody could blame me for every little inconvenience. Most people think generosity means saying yes forever. I've learned that real generosity also requires boundaries. Because when kindness becomes an expectation, gratitude often disappears. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is step back and let people carry responsibilities that were never yours to begin with. 6 o'clock didn't ruin Christmas. It simply revealed who thought Christmas belonged to me.